Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're exploring what if Naruto was the reincarnation of Ulquiorra Cifer from Bleach. This concept is absolutely broken, Ulquiorra's godlike hollow powers combined with Naruto's heart for connection. We're talking segunda etapa transformations, Lanza del Relampago techniques, and spiritual pressure that could crush reality itself, but wielded by someone who chooses bonds over emptiness. Imagine Naruto fighting pain in full Espada form, using techniques designed to kill gods as demonstrations of love and understanding. If this sounds epic, smash that like button and subscribe. Let's dive in. The first thing Naruto Uzumaki remembered wasn't his mother's face or his father's smile. It was the taste of sand and the weight of endless white sky. He was 3 years old when the dreams began, too young to understand why he would wake with tears on his cheeks and words in a language that didn't exist echoing in his mind. Hollow, espada, las noches. The syllables felt familiar on his tongue like a prayer he'd forgotten he knew. Another nightmare? Old Man Tuche would ask when Naruto stumbled into Ikaraku's before dawn, small fists rubbing sleep from eyes that sometimes seemed too ancient for his face. Naruto would nod and climb onto the too-tall stool, accepting a bowl of miso ramen he didn't remember ordering. But even as the warm broth filled his stomach, something deeper remained empty, a gnawing void that food couldn't touch. The other children avoided him. It wasn't just because of the whispers that followed him through the streets like autumn leaves, or the way adults' faces hardened when they saw his bright blonde hair. There was something else, something in the way Naruto would stare at them with those impossibly blue eyes and seem to look through them, as if measuring the weight of their souls. "He's strange," Sakura whispered to Ino during their first day at the academy. "He asked me what I thought about the concept of nothingness during lunch break. What kind of kid even knows words like that?" Naruto had overheard, of course. His hearing had always been unnaturally sharp, along with his ability to sense things others couldn't. He'd simply tilted his head and considered her question with the solemnity of someone far older. What kind of kid, indeed? The memories came in fragments like broken glass catching moonlight, a white palace with impossible geometry, the weight of a sword he'd never held, the sound of his own voice, cold and analytical, stating observations about the nature of the heart to beings whose names he couldn't quite recall. The heart, what is it? If I tear open your chest, will I see it? If I crack open your skull, will I find it there? Naruto would wake gasping from these visions, pressing his small hands to his chest as if checking that his heart still beat. Sometimes he thought he could feel an echo of something else there, a perfect circle of emptiness that existed just beneath his skin. "Uruka-sensei," he said one day after a particularly brutal sparring session where he'd moved with fluid precision that surprised everyone, including himself. "Do you think it's possible for someone to be empty and full at the same time?" Uruka paused in bandaging a cut on Naruto's knuckle, studying the boy's face with growing concern. At 8 years old, Naruto should have been asking about what was for lunch or complaining about homework. Instead, he posed philosophical questions that would challenge academy graduates. "What do you mean by empty, Naruto?" The boy was quiet for a long moment, staring out the classroom window at the carved faces of the Hokage. "Sometimes I feel like there's a hole inside me that nothing can fill. But then I think about Ikaraku's ramen or when you're proud of me or how the third Hokage smiles when I visit and I feel warm, like maybe the hole isn't really empty, maybe it's just waiting for the right things to fill it." Uruka's hand stilled. There was something in Naruto's voice, a quality of detached observation that seemed at odds with his usually boisterous nature. "Everyone feels lonely sometimes, Naruto. It doesn't make you empty." "No," Naruto said softly, still not looking away from the window. "This is different. This is like I'm remembering how to feel things for the first time." The incident that changed everything happened on a Tuesday. Naruto was walking home from the academy, his stomach growling and his thoughts drifting to whether he had enough money for ramen, when the first stone hit his shoulder. Then another struck his back, and suddenly he was surrounded by a group of older boys whose faces twisted with inherited hatred. "Monster," one spat, and Naruto felt something stir in the depths of his consciousness, not the warm, protective rage of the Nine Tails, but something colder. Something that observed the situation with detached interest. "My dad says you killed the fourth Hokage," another boy snarled, shoving Naruto backward. "Says you're not even human." Human, the cold voice in Naruto's mind mused. What an interesting concept. What precisely defines humanity? The ability to feel, to connect, or merely the shape of one's flesh? The beating began in earnest then, fists and feet striking with the cruel efficiency of children who had been taught that their target deserved no mercy. Naruto curled into a ball, protecting his head, but something was building inside him. A pressure that had nothing to do with the Nine Tails chakra and everything to do with those fragmentary dreams of white sand and endless sky. "Please," he whispered, but his voice sounded strange even to his own ears. Distant, clinical. "Stop!" The boys laughed and kicked harder. That was when Naruto's eyes changed. The blue drained away like water, replaced by brilliant green irises set in sclera black as night. The boys froze mid-kick, their laughter dying as a pressure unlike anything they had ever felt crashed down upon them. It was the spiritual weight of a being who had walked between worlds, who had faced gods and remained unmoved, who had contemplated the nature of existence from a throne made of bone. Pathetic, the voice that was and wasn't Naruto's own observed. Such weak spiritual pressure. Is this truly what passes for strength in this realm? One of the boys tried to run. He made it 3 steps before collapsing, overwhelmed by the sheer presence radiating from Naruto's small form. The others followed suit, crumpling to their knees as their bodies instinctively recognized a predator far beyond their understanding. Naruto rose slowly, dust falling from his torn clothes. Blood ran from his nose and split lip, but his expression was serene, the calm of someone who had seen civilizations rise and fall and found them all equally meaningless. "Fear," he said, and his voice carried harmonics that shouldn't have been possible from a child's throat. "This is what you feel now, this crushing weight that makes it difficult to breathe, difficult to think. This is what I have carried every day of this life, and you gave it to me." He took a step forward, and one of the boys whimpered. "I do not blame you," Naruto continued conversationally. "You are merely acting according to your nature, just as I am beginning to remember mine. But I find myself curious. What is it that you hope to accomplish through violence? Do you believe that by causing me pain, you will somehow fill the emptiness within yourselves?" The boy who had called him a monster tried to speak, but could only gasp for air. "No answer?" Naruto tilted his head with the predatory grace of a hunting cat. "How disappointing. I had hoped for more philosophical discourse." "Naruto," the sharp voice cut through the supernatural tension like a blade. Uruka rounded the corner at a run, having sensed the disturbance through means he didn't fully understand. He skidded to a stop when he saw the scene, children collapsed on the ground, and Naruto standing over them with eyes that belonged on no human face. "Uruka-sensei," Naruto said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice now, though his eyes remained that otherworldly green-black. "I was just having a discussion with my classmates about the nature of fear and its role in establishing social hierarchies." "Naruto," Uruka's voice was carefully controlled. "Let them go, let them." Naruto looked confused, then glanced down at the writhing boys as if noticing their distress for the first time. "Oh, how interesting, I didn't realize I was doing anything to them." The pressure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. The boys scrambled to their feet and fled without a word, leaving Uruka alone with a student whose nature he was only beginning to comprehend. "Your eyes," Uruka said quietly. Naruto blinked, and when his lids opened again, familiar blue had returned. "What about them?" "They were different." "Were they?" Naruto touched his face thoughtfully. "I've been having the strangest dreams lately, Uruka-sensei. Sometimes I dream that I'm someone else entirely, someone who lived in a place where the sky was always dark and the sand never ended. Someone who could fly." He paused, looking down at his hands with an expression of dawning wonder. "Someone who was very, very empty inside but didn't understand that emptiness could be filled." That night, Hiruzen Sarutobi sat in his office, smoking his pipe and contemplating the report Uruka had delivered. Spiritual pressure, eyes that changed color, a presence that could overwhelm grown men emanating from a 9-year-old boy. "What are you, Naruto?" he murmured to the empty room. Outside his window, the carved face of the fourth Hokage gazed out over the village with stone eyes that revealed nothing. But if Minato Namikaze could have seen his son in that moment, standing on his apartment balcony with his face turned toward the moon, small hands pressed to his chest, as if feeling for a heartbeat or perhaps something else entirely. He might have wondered the same thing. In his dreams that night, Naruto soared through an endless white sky on wings black as midnight, carrying within his chest a perfect circle of nothingness that somehow contained all the meaning in the world. He was beginning to remember who he used to be, but more importantly, he was beginning to understand who he might become. The bridge to the land of waves stretched out before them like a path to destiny, shrouded in the pre-dawn mist that seemed to cling to everything with ghostly fingers. Naruto walked beside his teammates, but his mind drifted between two sets of memories, those of a young ninja eager to prove himself, and those of something ancient and cold that had once ruled over endless white sands. Trash, the voice in his head, observed as Naruto watched Tazuna nervously adjust his glasses. This fear radiating from the old man is pathetic. He reeks of deception. "Something's wrong," Naruto said suddenly, his voice carrying that strange, analytical quality that had become more frequent since the incident with the bullies. "Tazuna-san is hiding something important." Kakashi glanced at him with interest. "What makes you think that?" Naruto tilted his head, considering how to explain the way he could taste the man's spiritual pressure, how it was laced with guilt and desperation that painted the air around him in shades of gray. His fear has layers: surface fear of bandits, deeper fear of something much worse, and underneath it all, the bitter taste of a lie told to protect people he cares about. "You're awfully perceptive today, Naruto," Sakura said, though there was something uneasy in her voice. Ever since the academy incident that Uruka had quietly reported, her teammates had begun watching Naruto with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "I've been thinking a lot about perception lately," Naruto replied, his blue eyes scanning the tree line with predatory focus. "How we see things, how we understand them, how sometimes the heart shows us truths that the eyes cannot." Sasuke frowned. There it was again, that philosophical bent that seemed so at odds with the dead last of their class. "What's that supposed to mean?" Before Naruto could answer, two figures materialized from behind a conveniently placed puddle, chains gleaming between them like metallic death. The demon brothers moved with the fluid precision of experienced killers, their spiked gauntlets aimed directly at Kakashi. What happened next occurred in the space between heartbeats. Naruto's eyes shifted, blue bleeding away to reveal brilliant green irises set in black sclera. The world around him slowed, spiritual pressures becoming visible as colored auras that outlined every living thing. The assassin's intentions blazed like torches in his enhanced perception. Pathetic, Ulquiorra's memories whispered, such crude spiritual pressure. Is this the caliber of warriors in this realm? "Kakashi-sensei," Naruto said, his voice eerily calm as the chains wrapped around their Jounin instructor, "step back." Time resumed its normal flow as the demon brothers completed their technique, shredding what they believed to be Kakashi into ribbons. Sasuke and Sakura gasped in horror, but Naruto simply observed with detached interest. "Interesting," he mused, noting how the pieces of their sensei dissolved into water. A substitution technique utilizing elemental transformation. Efficient. One of the assassins snarled and launched himself toward Tazuna, but found his path suddenly blocked by a small blonde figure who had moved faster than any genin should have been capable of. Naruto caught the spiked gauntlet with his bare hand, and the force that should have shattered bones simply stopped. Green energy flickered around his fingers like cold fire. "Hyro," he whispered, testing the word on his tongue as if remembering its meaning. The spiritual pressure radiating from his small form made the air itself feel heavy. Hardened spiritual energy used as armor. Fascinating that my body remembers this technique. The demon brother's eyes widened as his supposedly killing blow failed to even scratch the child's skin. "What are you?" Naruto tilted his head with the curious expression of a scientist examining an interesting specimen. "That is an excellent question. What am I?" Before the assassin could process this response, Naruto's free hand moved with surgical precision, striking nerve clusters with the calculated efficiency of someone who had studied anatomy across multiple lifetimes. The demon brother collapsed instantly, paralyzed but conscious. His partner attacked from behind, but Naruto simply vanished. Sonido, the cold voice in his mind, supplied, high-speed movement technique of the Arrancar. Though this is merely an echo of the original. Naruto reappeared behind the second assassin, one finger extended and glowing with condensed green energy. "Zero," he said experimentally, and a thin beam of spiritual power lanced out, neatly severing the chain connecting the brothers' weapons. "Naruto?" Kakashi's voice cut through the supernatural tension as he emerged from his hiding spot among the trees. "Stand down!" The green faded from Naruto's eyes, replaced by familiar blue, though something ancient lingered in their depths. "Kakashi-sensei," he said with genuine warmth, though his voice retained that unsettling analytical quality. "I was wondering when you would reveal yourself. Though I'm curious, were you testing our reactions or simply gathering intelligence on the attacker's capabilities?" Kakashi studied his student with new intensity. The boy's movements had been too precise, too clinical. And that energy, whatever it was, it definitely wasn't chakra. "Both," he admitted. "But Naruto, what was that technique you just used?" Naruto looked down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. I'm not entirely sure. Sometimes I remember things that I don't think I ever learned. Techniques, philosophies, entire conversations with people whose faces I can't quite recall." He paused, pressing a hand to his chest. "And sometimes I feel like there's a hole inside me that's supposed to be there, but I don't understand why." The journey to Tazuna's home passed in tense silence, with Kakashi keeping careful watch over his increasingly enigmatic student. When the full truth about Gato and the bridge finally emerged, along with the revelation that they would likely face Zabuza Mamachi, Naruto's reaction was not what anyone expected. "The demon of the mist," he said thoughtfully. "A master of silent killing who has transcended the normal limitations of his bloodline. Fascinating, I wonder. Do you think he understands the true nature of what it means to be empty inside?" "Naruto," Sakura said with growing concern, "you're talking like you know him personally." "Do I?" Naruto wondered aloud. "Sometimes the line between memory and knowledge becomes blurred." It was Sasuke who finally voiced what they were all thinking. "You're different. Ever since the academy, you've been different." "What happened to you?" Naruto was quiet for a long moment, watching mist curl around the approaching bridge like ghostly fingers. "I think I'm remembering who I used to be, or perhaps, who I really am." The battle came at dawn, with mist thick enough to cut and the sound of Zabuza's massive blade cleaving through the air like thunder. Kakashi engaged the missing nin directly while Team 7 formed a protective triangle around Tazuna, but the real fight began when the mirrors appeared. They rose from the ground like crystalline flowers blooming in fast-forward, perfect sheets of ice that reflected the world in fractured images. Haku stepped through one as if it were made of water, her masked face somehow conveying both regret and determination. "I'm sorry," she said softly, "but I cannot allow you to interfere with Zabuza-sama's mission." "Crystal ice mirrors," Sasuke breathed, his newly awakened sharing and spinning as it tried to track the technique. "She can move between them at will." Sakura gripped her kunai tighter. "Then we break them." But before anyone could move, Naruto stepped forward, his eyes already shifting to that otherworldly green-black. The spiritual pressure rolling off him made the very air shimmer. "Interesting," he said, and his voice carried harmonics that belonged in no human throat. "A manipulation of water's crystalline structure using spiritual energy to maintain cohesion. The mirrors serve as both weapons and transportation medium, a fascinating application of three-dimensional spatial manipulation." Haku paused, caught off guard by the clinical analysis. "You understand my technique?" "I understand many things," Naruto replied, raising one hand toward the mirrors. Green energy began to coalesce around his fingertips. "I understand that you move between reflections by temporarily existing in the spaces between matter. I understand that your speed is not truly superhuman, but rather a function of reduced spiritual friction. And I understand," the energy in his hand pulsed brighter, "that everything in this realm has a spiritual pressure that can be measured, analyzed, and overwhelmed." "Naruto, don't!" Sasuke shouted, recognizing the same cold precision that had paralyzed those village children. But Naruto was already in motion. He didn't run toward the mirrors, he simply was elsewhere, appearing behind Haku with the fluid grace of someone who had forgotten the concept of physical limitations. Sonido, his mind supplied. To sound, the technique of moving faster than sound itself. Your technique relies on momentum and trajectory, he said conversationally as Haku spun to face him, senbon needles already flying. But what happens when your opponent exists outside the normal parameters of space and time? The needles passed through empty air as Naruto flickered out of existence again, reappearing at different points around the mirror dome with increasing speed. Each time he materialized, green energy gathered in his hands. "Zero," he said, and beams of condensed spiritual power lanced out, striking the mirrors with surgical precision. But instead of shattering them, the energy seemed to analyze them, mapping their structure and weaknesses. Haku's movements became increasingly frantic as she tried to keep up with an opponent who seemed to exist in multiple places simultaneously. "Impossible, no one can move that fast. Speed is relative," Naruto replied from everywhere and nowhere at once. "When you truly understand the nature of space, movement becomes a matter of will rather than velocity." Finally, he stopped, standing in the center of the mirror dome with his arms crossed. The green energy around him had formed into something resembling wings, translucent and ethereal but undeniably present. "Your technique is impressive," he said with genuine appreciation. "But it has a fundamental flaw." "What flaw?" Haku demanded, though there was more curiosity than anger in her voice. Naruto smiled, and for a moment, the expression carried all the warmth and determination that his friends remembered. "It assumes your opponent cares about the conventional rules of combat." He raised both hands and the green energy exploded outward, not destructively, but analytically. It flowed through the mirrors like water, mapping every angle and reflection, understanding the technique at its most fundamental level. "Pesquisa," he whispered, "spiritual reconnaissance. Now I can see the pattern." When the energy faded, the mirrors remained intact, but something had changed. Naruto no longer looked like he was trapped, he looked like he was exactly where he wanted to be. "Your turn," he said to Haku with that same warm smile. "But I should warn you, I'm not the same person who entered these mirrors." Haku hesitated, sensing the truth in his words. The spiritual pressure emanating from the blonde boy was unlike anything she had ever encountered, ancient and cold, yet somehow filled with an underlying warmth that defied explanation. "What are you?" she asked, echoing the demon brother's earlier question. Naruto's eyes flickered between blue and green as he considered his answer. "I am Naruto Uzumaki," he said finally. "Future Hokage, lover of ramen and guardian of precious people, but I am also—" The wings of green energy spread wider. "Something that this world has never seen before. Something that remembers being empty but is learning to be full." In the end, it was not violence that broke the stalemate but understanding. When Naruto explained that he could see the loneliness in Haku's spiritual pressure, the same emptiness that he carried within himself, the Ice Maiden found herself lowering her weapons. "You truly are something unique," she said softly, allowing the mirrors to melt away. "I have never encountered anyone who could perceive the heart so clearly." "The heart," Naruto repeated, the words triggering a cascade of fragmentary memories. "Yes, that's what this is about, isn't it? Understanding what it means to have one, to use one, to protect one." As they emerged from the dissipating ice dome, they found Kakashi and Zabuza locked in their own philosophical battle, one that ended not with death, but with Gato's arrival and the subsequent uprising of the Wave Country's citizens. Standing on the completed bridge as the sun finally burned away the morning mist, Naruto looked out over the water and felt something shift inside him. The hole in his chest, that perfect circle of emptiness that Ulquiorra had carried, was still there, but it no longer felt like an absence. It felt like potential. "Sensei," he said to Kakashi as they prepared to return to Konoha, "do you think it's possible for someone to be two different people at the same time?" Kakashi studied his student, this boy who moved like a predator and spoke like a philosopher, whose eyes held depths that belonged to someone far older. "I think," he said carefully, "that we are all more complex than we appear on the surface. The question is what we choose to do with that complexity." Naruto nodded, satisfied with the answer. As Team 7 began their journey home, he fell into step beside his teammates, but part of his consciousness remained focused inward, where the memories of Ulquiorra Cifer continued their slow awakening. He was beginning to understand that the heart was not something you possessed, but something you chose to use. And unlike his predecessor, Naruto Uzumaki had people worth using it for. The question was whether those same people would still accept him when they learned the full truth of what he was becoming. The forest of death loomed before them like a green cathedral of shadows and secrets, its ancient trees twisted into shapes that seemed to whisper warnings to those foolish enough to enter. Naruto stood at the entrance with his teammates, but his attention was focused inward, where Ulquiorra's memories had been stirring with increasing frequency since the incident at Wave. This place reeks of spiritual pressure, the cold voice observed as Naruto's enhanced senses cataloged the various life forces hidden within the dense foliage, predators and prey locked in an eternal dance. How familiar. Naruto, Sakura whispered, noticing the way his eyes had taken on that distant, analytical quality. You're doing it again. Doing what? Looking like you're somewhere else entirely. Naruto blinked, focusing on his teammate's concerned face. Sorry, Sakura-chan, sometimes I hear echoes, thoughts that aren't quite my own. Sasuke frowned, his newly awakened sharing in spinning slowly as it tried to read the spiritual energy that seemed to fluctuate around his blonde teammate. Those aren't normal chakra fluctuations. No, Naruto agreed quietly. They're not chakra at all. The second phase of the Chunin exams had barely begun when Team 7 encountered their first real test, not the oversized insects or environmental hazards that other teams feared, but something far more dangerous. The spiritual pressure hit Naruto like a physical blow, ancient and malevolent and utterly alien to this world. Orochimaru, he whispered, the name emerging from somewhere deep in his consciousness. Not from his own memories, but from something older, something that had faced beings of similar power in realms of eternal night. The snake Sannin materialized from the shadows with the fluid grace of a nightmare-given form, his golden eyes fixed on Sasuke with predatory interest. But when his gaze fell on Naruto, something shifted in his expression. How interesting, Orochimaru hissed, his forked tongue tasting the air. There's something familiar about your spiritual signature, boy. Something that doesn't belong in this world. Naruto felt the change begin before he could stop it. The hole in his chest, that perfect circle of emptiness that had remained dormant since Wave, suddenly blazed with cold fire. His eyes shifted to green-black, and the spiritual pressure that exploded outward made the very air shimmer with otherworldly energy. Orochimaru of the Sannin, he said, his voice carrying harmonics that belonged in no human throat. A being who has transcended the normal limitations of mortality through forbidden knowledge. Fascinating, you remind me of someone I once knew. Aizen, Ulquiorra's memories whispered. Another who sought to become God through cunning and manipulation. The snake Sannin's eyes narrowed. What are you, child? That spiritual pressure. It's not chakra, not sage energy, not even natural energy. It's something else entirely. I am, Naruto paused, feeling the weight of two identities pressing against his consciousness. I am Naruto Uzumaki, but I am also the echo of someone who stood in the shadow of false gods and found them wanting. Before anyone could react, Naruto simply vanished. Sunito, he reappeared behind Orochimaru, one hand extended and crackling with green energy. Zero, he said experimentally, and a beam of concentrated spiritual power lanced out, carving a perfectly circular hole through an ancient oak tree. Orochimaru spun with inhuman speed, but Naruto was already elsewhere, his form flickering between positions with the fluid grace of someone who had forgotten the concept of physical limitations. Your technique is impressive, the boy said conversationally as he materialized atop a nearby branch. The way you manipulate your cellular structure to achieve near immortality shows remarkable understanding of biological systems. But tell me, he tilted his head with that predatory curiosity that made Sasuke's blood run cold. Do you truly believe that extending your mortal existence brings you closer to understanding the nature of eternity? Impossible, Orochimaru breathed, his golden eyes wide with something approaching awe. That movement technique, that energy, you're not human, are you? Naruto considered the question with the detached interest of a scientist examining a particularly fascinating specimen. Human, an interesting classification. What defines humanity? The shape of one's flesh, the origin of one's soul, or perhaps the capacity to form bonds with others? As he spoke, something began to manifest around him, a presence that made the very fabric of reality seem to bend and warp. The other teams scattered throughout the forest suddenly found themselves overcome with inexplicable terror, their primitive instincts screaming at them to flee from something their rational minds couldn't comprehend. The heart, Naruto continued, pressing a hand to his chest where the hollow hole was beginning to manifest as a visible darkness. That's what you seek to understand, isn't it? The thing that drives mortals to strive, to love, to despair. But you approach it from the wrong direction. The darkness on his chest spread outward, forming intricate patterns across his skin, markings that belonged to a form that existed beyond the boundaries of life and death. You seek to preserve the flesh that houses the heart, Naruto said, his voice now carrying the cold authority of absolute certainty. But what happens when the heart itself transcends the need for flesh? Orochimaru's hands moved in a blur, weaving seals for techniques that could level mountains, but when he looked up, Naruto was simply gone. Behind you, the boy's voice whispered, and Orochimaru spun to find green-black eyes staring at him from a face that had taken on an otherworldly beauty, pale skin marked with intricate patterns, hair that moved as if underwater, and an expression of serene detachment that belonged on no mortal face. "This is what I am becoming," Naruto said softly, the echo of someone who found emptiness in godhood but who is learning to find meaning in connection. He raised one hand, and spiritual energy began to coalesce around his fingers, not the crude blast of a Zero, but something more refined, more purposeful. "Lanza del Relampago," he whispered, and a spear of green lightning materialized in his grasp. The Lance of Lightning, a technique designed to pierce the hearts of gods. Orochimaru's pupils dilated as he felt the sheer destructive potential radiating from the ethereal weapon. What are you?" "I am the fourth Espada," Naruto replied, and for a moment his voice carried the weight of absolute authority that had once commanded armies of hollows in a realm of eternal night. "I am Ulquiorra Cifer, who stood at the right hand of a false god and found him lacking." The spear pulsed with barely contained power. "And I am Naruto Uzumaki, who refuses to let emptiness define him." He drew back his arm as if to throw, and Orochimaru tensed, preparing techniques that might allow him to survive what was essentially a divine judgment made manifest. But instead of attacking, Naruto simply stopped. The spear dissipated like morning mist, the markings on his skin faded, and his eyes returned to their familiar blue. He swayed slightly as if the transformation had drained him and suddenly looked like nothing more than a 12-year-old boy standing alone in a forest. He whispered, staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. "I remember now, not everything, but enough." He looked up at Orochimaru with an expression of dawning understanding. "You're afraid. Beneath all that power, all that knowledge, all those techniques designed to grant you immortality, you're terrified of the void that waits beyond death. That's why you seek to extend your existence indefinitely." "Silence," Orochimaru snarled, but there was something desperate in his voice now. "I understand that fear," Naruto continued gently. "I've lived in that void. I've been that emptiness, that perfect absence of meaning and connection. But you know what I learned?" He took a step forward, and despite everything, despite the power he just displayed, despite the otherworldly presence that still clung to him like a second skin, his smile was pure Naruto Uzumaki. "The void is only empty if you choose to keep it that way." The confrontation ended not with violence but with confusion. Orochimaru, faced with something his vast knowledge couldn't categorize or control, chose strategic withdrawal over prolonged engagement. But not before leaving his mark, literally, in the form of a cursed seal burned into Sasuke's neck. As the snake Sannin's presence faded, Naruto collapsed to his knees, the weight of his awakening memories threatening to overwhelm his still-developing consciousness. Sakura and Sasuke rushed to his side, but he held up a hand to forestall their concerns. "I'm okay," he said, though his voice shook with exhaustion. "Just processing some things I remembered." "Naruto," Sasuke said quietly, one hand pressed to his newly cursed neck. "What was that? That power, that presence? What are you?" Naruto was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the canopy of leaves that filtered the afternoon sunlight into patterns of light and shadow. "I think," he said finally, "I'm someone who died a long time ago in a place very far from here, someone who thought he understood what it meant to be empty." He pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly but refusing Sakura's offered support. "But I'm also Naruto Uzumaki, who's learning that emptiness isn't the absence of meaning, it's the potential for infinite meaning." They spent the rest of the phase in relative quiet, with Naruto wrestling with memories that came in fragments and flashes. Images of a white palace with impossible architecture, the weight of a sword he'd carried for centuries, conversations with beings whose names carried the weight of divine authority. And through it all, the growing understanding that he was becoming something unprecedented, a fusion of Ulquiorra's cold analytical nature and Naruto's warm, connecting heart. The preliminaries arrived with all the fanfare of a festival, but for Naruto, the arena felt like a stage where he would have to choose between his two natures. When his name was called against Kiba and Uruka, he walked to the center of the floor with the calm confidence of someone who had faced far more dangerous opponents in realms where defeat meant true death. "This should be interesting," he said to his opponent with genuine warmth. "I've been curious about how your clan's partnership with canine companions affects your spiritual resonance patterns." Kiba blinked. "My what now? Your spiritual energy," Naruto clarified, his eyes already beginning to shift. "It's fascinating how it intertwines with Akamaru's, two distinct life forces operating in perfect harmony. I wonder." The change was subtle this time, just a flicker of green in his irises, a slight sharpening of his spiritual senses. But it was enough to activate his Pesquisa, painting the world in auras of spiritual pressure that revealed every technique, every weakness, every fear. "I wonder if you understand how beautiful that bond truly is." The fight, if it could even be called that, lasted less than 30 seconds. Naruto moved with the fluid precision of someone who could see every attack before it was launched, every opening before it appeared. He didn't hurt Kiba or Akamaru, he simply was where they weren't until they exhausted themselves trying to land a single blow. "Enough," Hate called, coughing slightly. "Winner, Naruto Uzumaki." As Naruto walked back to the observation deck, he found himself surrounded by stares of confusion, fear, and something approaching awe. But it was Neji's voice that cut through the silence. "You," the Hyuga prodigy said, his Byakugan active and showing him spiritual flows that defied conventional understanding. "What you just displayed, that wasn't ninjutsu. That wasn't even chakra." Naruto paused, turning to face his fellow genin with an expression of genuine interest. "You can see it, can't you? The way spiritual energy moves differently than chakra. How fascinating. I've been wondering if there were others in this world who could perceive such things." "Answer the question," Neji demanded. "What are you?" Naruto smiled, and for a moment, the expression carried both the warmth of a boy who dreamed of being Hokage and the ancient wisdom of a being who had witnessed the rise and fall of gods. "I'm still figuring that out," he admitted. "But when I do, I promise you'll be among the first to know." As he took his place among his fellow genin, Naruto felt something shift within him, not the hollow awakening that had been happening in fragments, but something deeper. A choice crystallizing in his mind with absolute clarity. He would not become Ulquiorra Cifer reborn. He would become something entirely new, something that combined the analytical perfection of the fourth Espada with the boundless potential of Naruto Uzumaki. The question was whether the world would survive his transformation. The Valley of the End stretched before them like a wound carved into the earth itself, its massive waterfalls thundering down between the stone giants of Hashirama and Madara, two legends whose own conflict had once shattered the world. Now, 3 years after the Chunin exams, two boys who carried the weight of destiny stood facing each other across the churning waters. Sasuke Uchiha had changed. The cursed seal on his neck pulsed with dark energy, and his eyes burned with the three-tomo Sharingan that promised death to anyone who opposed his quest for power. But it was more than physical transformation. There was something hollow in his gaze, something that had been carved out by grief and filled with nothing but hatred. Naruto, too, was different. Taller now, his hair longer and somehow more ethereal, as if it moved to winds that existed in dimensions beyond the physical world. His blue eyes held depths that belonged to someone far older, and when he breathed, the air around him shimmered with barely contained spiritual pressure. "You came," Sasuke said, his voice flat and emotionless. I wasn't sure you would. Of course I came, Naruto replied, and his tone carried both the warmth of their old friendship and something else, an analytical quality that seemed to weigh and measure everything it encountered. You're my best friend, Sasuke. My bond to you transcends the boundaries between life and death, between existence and void. Bonds, Sasuke spat, activating his cursed seal. Dark flames spread across his skin as his chakra exploded outward. You still don't understand, do you? Bonds are weakness. They're chains that hold us back from achieving true power. Naruto watched the transformation with the detached interest of someone who had witnessed far more dramatic changes in form and function. Is that what you believe? That power requires isolation, that strength demands emptiness? His own eyes began to shift, blue bleeding away to reveal brilliant green irises set in sclera black as night. How interesting. You seek to become what I once was, a being defined entirely by absence, by the void where connection used to exist. What are you talking about? Sasuke snarled, but there was something in Naruto's spiritual pressure that made his cursed seal react with violent fluctuations. I'm talking about understanding, Naruto said softly, raising one hand as green energy began to coalesce around his fingers. About the difference between choosing emptiness and having emptiness choose you. The first exchange happened at superhuman speed. Sasuke's Chidori screamed through the air, lightning chakra condensed into a spear of pure destruction, but Naruto simply wasn't there anymore. Finito. He reappeared behind Sasuke, moving faster than even the Sharingan could track. Your technique is impressive, he observed clinically. Lightning chakra shaped and concentrated through precise control and emotional focus. But tell me, Sasuke, what happens when you face an opponent who exists outside the normal parameters of speed and space? Sasuke spun, launching a great fireball technique that should have incinerated everything in its path. Instead, Naruto raised his hand and the flames simply stopped. Hiro, he explained conversationally, spiritual energy hardened to the point where it becomes absolute defense. Your fire cannot touch me because my spiritual pressure exists on a different dimensional plane than your chakra. Impossible! Sasuke activated his cursed seal's second stage, wings of dark energy erupting from his back as his appearance became increasingly inhuman. I won't lose to you again. He launched himself forward with incredible speed, but Naruto met him in midair with fluid grace that belonged to someone who had never forgotten how to fly. Because suddenly, Naruto was flying. Wings of pure spiritual energy unfurled from his back, not the crude constructs of chakra manipulation, but manifestations of power that existed beyond the physical realm. They were beautiful and terrible, like fragments of green starlight given form, and when they beat the air, reality itself seemed to ripple. Resurrection, Naruto whispered, and his voice carried harmonics that made the very stones of the valley resonate. The release of one's true form, the return to what one truly is beneath the mask of flesh and bone. His appearance had changed dramatically. His skin had taken on an otherworldly pallor, marked with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living tattoos. His hair moved as if underwater, and his nails had lengthened into claws that could carve reality itself. But most striking were his eyes. Those green irises now blazed with the cold fire of stars dying in the void, and when he looked at Sasuke, it was with the gaze of someone who had witnessed the birth and death of universes. This is what I am becoming, he said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. Not human, not entirely, but not hollow either, something new, something that chooses connection over isolation, meaning over void. Sasuke attacked with desperate fury, launching technique after technique, fire, lightning, wind, combinations that should have leveled mountains. But Naruto moved through it all with serene grace, his spiritual pressure creating a barrier that turned aside attacks like they were falling leaves. You're afraid, Naruto observed, catching one of Sasuke's punches without seeming to exert any effort. Beneath all that hatred, all that power you've gained from Orochimaru, you're terrified of being alone. That's why you push everyone away, because if you never let anyone close, you never have to face the possibility of losing them. Shut up, Sasuke screamed, activating techniques that pushed his cursed seal beyond its normal limits. You don't know anything about me. I know everything about you, Naruto replied sadly. Because I know what it feels like to be empty. I know what it means to exist in a void where connection has no meaning, where bonds are just words without substance. He raised both hands and spiritual energy began to gather between his palms, not the crude blast of a zero, but something far more refined and devastating. Zero Oscuras, he said softly, the Black Zero, a technique that exists beyond the boundaries of normal spiritual attacks. It doesn't just destroy the body, it annihilates the very concept of existence itself. The energy between his hands pulsed with darkness so absolute that it seemed to devour light itself. Sasuke's Sharingan spun frantically, but it couldn't track something that existed outside the normal spectrum of reality. "But I won't use it on you," Naruto continued, allowing the technique to dissipate. "Do you know why? Because you're weak," Sasuke snarled, though his voice shook with something that might have been relief. "Because I choose to be strong in a different way," Naruto corrected gently. "Because I learned something that my predecessor never understood." He descended slowly, his ethereal wings folding behind him as he touched down on the water's surface. The spiritual pressure radiating from his form made the liquid beneath his feet freeze into patterns that resembled crystalline flowers. "The heart," he said, pressing one hand to his chest where a perfect circle of darkness was now visible, not empty, but filled with swirling galaxies of green light. "It's not something you possess or something you protect. It's something you choose to use." "What are you talking about?" Sasuke demanded, but his cursed seal was beginning to recede, as if his body instinctively recognized that continued aggression would be futile. "Ulquiorra Cifer," Naruto said, and the name carried weight that made the air itself tremble. "The fourth Espada who stood at the right hand of a god and found him wanting. Who possessed power beyond mortal comprehension but never understood what it meant to have a heart." His form began to change again, the markings on his skin growing more intricate, more complex. Wings of bone and membrane erupted from his back, not the ethereal constructs of his first release, but solid, physical manifestations of otherworldly anatomy. "This is Segunda Etapa," he explained as horns spiraled from his temples and his tail lashed behind him like a living weapon. "The second stage of resurrection. The form that transcends even the boundaries between life and death." He was no longer recognizable as human. His appearance had become something from nightmares and divine visions, beautiful and terrible, alien yet somehow achingly familiar. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of one who had commanded legions in realms where physics was merely a suggestion. "In this form, I could unmake you with a thought," he said matter-of-factly. "I could erase your existence so completely that even the memory of your passing would fade from the world. But do you know why I don't?" Sasuke couldn't speak. The spiritual pressure emanating from Naruto's transformed state was so overwhelming that it was all he could do to remain conscious. "Because you matter to me," Naruto said simply. "Because in all the vast emptiness of existence, in all the cold void between stars, you are one of the few things that gives my life meaning." He took a step forward, and his footprint left crystalline patterns in the water that resembled mathematical equations written in languages that had never existed. "Ulquiorra never understood that," he continued softly. "He had all this power, all this knowledge, but he never learned that the heart isn't about feeling, it's about choosing to connect despite the risk of loss." His hand reached out toward Sasuke, claws that could cut through dimensions extending in a gesture of friendship. "I choose you, Sasuke, not because you're perfect, not because you're strong, but because you're my friend. Because in a universe filled with infinite emptiness, the bonds we forge are the only things that truly matter." For a moment, something flickered in Sasuke's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or memory of who they used to be before power and pain carved away their innocence. His hand rose as if to take Naruto's offered grasp, but then the cursed seal pulsed and Orochimaru's influence reasserted itself. "No," Sasuke whispered, then louder, "no, I won't be weak. I won't let bonds hold me back." He channeled every technique he'd learned, every forbidden jutsu Orochimaru had taught him, pouring his chakra into one final, desperate attack, a combination of Chidori and cursed seal energy that should have been capable of killing a cage. It struck Naruto directly in the chest, lightning and dark chakra tearing through his transformed flesh with devastating effect. And Naruto simply stood there and took it. "Why?" Sasuke gasped as his attack faded, leaving Naruto wounded but still standing. "Why didn't you defend yourself?" Naruto looked down at the smoking hole in his torso, a wound that was already beginning to close with supernatural regeneration, and smiled with infinite sadness. Because you needed to know, he said softly. You needed to understand that no amount of power can fill the void in your heart. That hatred, no matter how justified, will only make that emptiness larger. His segunda etapa began to fade, wings and horns dissolving into motes of green light. The markings on his skin retreated and his eyes returned to their familiar blue, though they retained depths that spoke of experiences beyond mortal comprehension. I won't chase you anymore, Sasuke, he said as he collapsed to one knee, exhaustion finally claiming him. But I won't give up on you either, because someday when you've explored every path that leads away from connection, you'll remember that there's always one that leads back home. Sasuke stared at his wounded friend, this being who could have destroyed him without effort but chose instead to offer understanding, and felt something crack inside his chest. Not his ribs, but something deeper, something that had been frozen for so long he'd forgotten it existed. I have to go, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I know, Naruto replied, still smiling despite the pain. But remember, no matter how far you travel into the darkness, no matter how empty you think you've become, the light of our bond will always be there to guide you back. As Sasuke activated a transportation technique and vanished into the gathering dusk, Naruto remained kneeling by the water's edge. The Valley of the End had witnessed another battle between friends turned enemies, but this time, something was different. This time, love had been offered freely, without condition or expectation of return. And in the depths of his hollow hole, that perfect circle of darkness that had once represented only emptiness, Naruto felt something new beginning to grow. Not the absence of meaning, but the presence of infinite possibility. He was no longer Ulquiorra Cifer, who had never understood the heart. He was no longer just Naruto Uzumaki, who had dreamed of being acknowledged. He was becoming something unprecedented, a being who chose connection over isolation, meaning over void, love over power. The question was whether the world was ready for what he was becoming. 3 years had passed since the Valley of the End, 3 years of training under Jiraiya's increasingly bewildered guidance as Naruto learned to control powers that existed outside the scope of conventional shinobi knowledge. When he returned to Konoha, walking through the village gates with the easy confidence of someone who had touched the boundaries between life and death, the changes were immediately apparent to anyone with the spiritual sensitivity to perceive them. He was taller now, his frame lean and graceful in a way that suggested otherworldly refinement rather than human athleticism. His blonde hair had grown longer, moving with subtle currents that seemed to respond to energies invisible to normal perception. But it was his eyes that drew the most attention, still blue, but containing depths that spoke of experiences no mortal should possess. Naruto, Sakura breathed when she saw him in the Hokage's office, her medical training allowing her to sense the vast spiritual pressure he kept carefully contained beneath his human appearance. You're different. We all are, he replied with a smile that managed to be both warmly familiar and disturbingly serene. 3 years is a long time. People change, grow, discover new aspects of themselves. Kakashi studied his former student with the one eye not covered by his hit, noting the way Naruto's presence seemed to bend the very air around him. Your chakra signature is unusual. It feels like it's existing on multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. Not chakra, Naruto corrected gently, settling into the chair across from Tsunede's desk with fluid grace. Spiritual pressure, a form of energy that exists beyond the normal parameters of this world's power systems. Tsunade frowned, her own considerable spiritual awareness picking up emanations that made her instincts scream warnings about predators and void-touched entities. Jiraiya's reports mentioned some irregularities in your training. He said you were developing abilities that he couldn't explain or replicate. Sensei did his best, Naruto said with genuine affection. But how do you teach someone to control memories that belong to a being who existed in a realm of eternal night? How do you train techniques that were designed for use against gods? The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the implications of his words settled over them. Naruto, Sakura said carefully, what exactly happened to you during those 3 years? He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the village he had sworn to protect. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had wrestled with questions that challenged the very nature of existence. I remembered, he said simply, not everything but enough. Enough to understand what I am, what I was, and what I'm becoming. His eyes shifted slightly, not to the green-black of his transformed state but to something deeper. For just an instant, those watching him could see layers upon layers of memory stretching back through time, through realms, through forms of existence that had no names in human language. I am Naruto Uzumaki, son of the 4th Hokage, Jinchuriki of the 9-tailed fox, future Hokage of Konoha. But I am also the echo of Ulquiorra Cifer, 4th Espada of Aizen Sasuke's Arrancar army, who stood at the right hand of a false god and found him wanting. The words hung in the air like a challenge to reality itself. 2 souls, Tsunade said slowly, her medical knowledge trying to process the implications. Or 1 soul with 2 sets of memories. Something more complex than either, Naruto replied, pressing a hand to his chest where, beneath his jacket, the faint outline of a hollow hole could be seen. I am what happens when emptiness learns to be full, when void discovers meaning, when a being designed for isolation chooses connection. The reunion with Team 7 was both joyful and deeply unsettling. When they gathered at their old training ground, the weight of Naruto's transformed presence made even the familiar surroundings feel strange and ethereal. You've gotten stronger, Kakashi observed as they went through basic exercises, watching his former student move with a fluid precision that belonged to someone who had mastered combat on levels beyond human comprehension. Strength is relative, Naruto replied, effortlessly dodging Sakura's chakra-enhanced punches without seeming to exert any effort. I've learned techniques that could unmake reality itself, but I've also learned that true power lies in choosing restraint. He paused mid-dodge, allowing one of Sakura's strikes to connect. The blow should have sent him flying, but instead, he simply absorbed the impact with barely a shift in stance. Hiro, he explained to her surprised expression, spiritual energy hardened to the point of near invulnerability. But more importantly, he reached out and gently touched her forehead, and for just an instant, Sakura could feel the vast ocean of emptiness that existed within him, not the absence of feeling, but the presence of infinite potential. I've learned that allowing someone to touch you, even to hurt you, can be more powerful than any technique designed for destruction. Sakura stumbled backward, her medical training screaming warnings about the otherworldly energy she'd just encountered. What was that feeling? It was like standing at the edge of an endless void. The hollow hole, Naruto said matter-of-factly, the defining characteristic of my previous existence. A perfect circle of emptiness that represents the absence of heart, of connection, of meaning. He smiled, and the expression was pure Naruto Uzumaki, warm, determined, slightly mischievous. But emptiness, I've discovered, is just another word for potential, and I've found many things worth filling it with. Their first mission as a reunited team brought them face-to-face with a group of missing nin whose techniques involved manipulating the souls of their victims, a perfect test case for Naruto's evolved abilities. When the enemy leader launched a jutsu designed to rip the spirit from his body, Naruto simply stood there and let it happen. Interesting, he said conversationally as the technique struck him full force. You're attempting to separate my soul from my physical form, but what happens when your target's soul exists partially outside normal space-time parameters? The missing nin's eyes widened as his supposedly infallible technique simply failed. The spiritual energy that should have torn Naruto's soul from his body instead encountered something that existed on multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. Impossible, the man gasped. Nothing can resist the Soul Ripper technique. Your technique assumes a conventional soul, Naruto explained, his eyes shifting to that familiar green-black. But what you're facing is something unprecedented, a fusion of human spirit and hollow essence, bound together by choices rather than nature. He raised one hand, and spiritual pressure began to gather around his fingers, not the destructive force of a zero, but something more analytical. Pesquisa, he said softly, and waves of green energy flowed outward, mapping the spiritual structure of every living thing within a mile radius. Spiritual reconnaissance. Now I can see exactly how your technique functions, and more importantly, the energy coalesced into a perfect replica of the missing nin's soul manipulation jutsu, but refined, perfected, stripped of its cruder elements. How to improve it? What followed was less a battle than a lesson in the fundamental differences between human chakra manipulation and hollow spiritual techniques. Naruto moved through the enemy formation with fluid grace, not destroying his opponents, but rather demonstrating the vast gulf that existed between their understanding of spiritual energy and his own. "You see souls as things to be manipulated," he said as he effortlessly countered technique after technique. "But souls are not objects, they are processes, patterns of energy that define the very nature of existence itself." He gestured, and the missing nin found their own techniques turning against them, not through force, but through superior understanding of the principles underlying their abilities. "When you truly comprehend the nature of the soul," Naruto continued, "manipulation becomes unnecessary. Understanding is sufficient." By the time the confrontation ended, the missing nin were unconscious but unharmed, their techniques neutralized through methods they couldn't even begin to comprehend. "How did you do that?" Sakura asked as they secured their prisoners. "I showed them the difference between working against the nature of spiritual energy and working with it," Naruto replied. "Their techniques were crude, like trying to perform surgery with a hammer. Once you understand the underlying principles, refinement becomes inevitable." It was during their return journey that the real test came. They were traveling through a forest when Naruto suddenly stopped, his head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. "Kurama," he said softly, and his teammates realized he was speaking to the Nine Tails. "You've been very quiet lately. Can you blame me, Kit?" The fox's voice was audible to all of them now, projected through Naruto's enhanced spiritual abilities. "Your other passenger makes me uncomfortable." "Other passenger?" Kakashi inquired, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew what the fox meant. Naruto's expression grew contemplative. "The memories of Ulquiorra Cifer aren't just knowledge, they're a complete spiritual imprint of a being who existed for centuries in a realm where emotions were considered weaknesses. His presence within me creates complications." As if responding to the mention of his name, those memories stirred. For just an instant, Naruto's demeanor shifted, his expression became distant, analytical, touched with the cold authority of someone who had commanded armies of hollows. "Fascinating," he said, and his voice carried harmonics that belonged in no human throat. "A tailed beast, bound to a human host through techniques I do not recognize. The spiritual pressure is impressive, though crude compared to the Espada's refined approaches to power manipulation." "Naruto," Sakura said uncertainly. The cold expression flickered, warmth returning to his features. "Sorry," he said, pressing a hand to his forehead. Sometimes his perspective bleeds through. He finds this world interesting, but he approaches everything from the viewpoint of someone who never understood emotional connections. "That's what worries me," Kurama growled. "This Ulquiorra, his memories carry the weight of absolute emptiness. What happens if his influence grows stronger than your own?" It was a question that had haunted Naruto for the past 3 years, the central conflict of his existence. Was he Naruto Uzumaki who remembered being Ulquiorra Cifer, or was he Ulquiorra Cifer who had learned to care through Naruto's experiences? "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "But I do know this, I won't let emptiness define me. I've seen what it leads to, the cold perfection of existence without meaning. I choose something different." He looked at his teammates, at Kakashi's concerned expression, at Sakura's mix of fear and determination, and felt something warm in the hollow space of his chest. "I choose you," he said simply. "All of you. I choose the bonds that Ulquiorra never understood, the connections that give meaning to existence." But even as he spoke the words, a part of him wondered if choice would be enough. The memories were growing stronger, more detailed, more compelling. And with them came the temptation of Ulquiorra's cold perfection, the peace that came from existing without the pain of caring, without the vulnerability of connection. As they continued their journey back to Konoha, Naruto walked slightly apart from his teammates, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. He was becoming something unprecedented, but the final form of that transformation remained uncertain. Would he be the hollow who learned to love, or the human who forgot how to feel? The answer, he suspected, would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone he had sworn to protect. The news reached Naruto while he was meditating in the forest outside Konoha, his consciousness partially immersed in the realm where Ulquiorra's memories resided like crystalline structures in an ocean of void. Jiraiya was dead, killed by pain. The the leader of the Akatsuki who had brought destruction to the Hidden Rain village and now threatened to do the same to Konoha. When the messenger found him, Naruto was sitting perfectly still beneath an ancient oak, his spiritual pressure so carefully controlled that he seemed more like a statue than a living being. But when the words registered, Jiraiya-sensei is dead, something fundamental shifted within him. The hollow hole in his chest, that perfect circle of emptiness that had been learning to contain meaning rather than void, suddenly blazed with cold fire. The air around him began to shimmer as his spiritual pressure spiked beyond anything he had previously displayed. How? His voice was perfectly calm, but the messenger could feel reality itself beginning to bend under the weight of barely contained power. "Pain of the Akatsuki," the shinobi stammered, his instincts screaming at him to flee from whatever this young man was becoming. "The village is under attack. The Hokage requests your immediate return." Naruto rose with fluid grace, and for just an instant his form seemed to blur between dimensions. Human flesh overlaid with the echo of pale skin marked with intricate patterns, blonde hair that moved like it was underwater, eyes that shifted between blue and green-black with increasing frequency. "Pain," he repeated, and the name carried harmonics that made the very trees lean away from him. How appropriate! He believes he understands suffering, but he has never experienced true emptiness. By the time Naruto reached Konoha, the village was in ruins. Pain's 6 paths had carved through the ninja forces with systematic precision, and now the real body, Nagato, hidden somewhere in the surrounding forest, was preparing to unleash Shinra Tensei on a scale that would erase the village from existence. Naruto stood on the Hokage monument, looking down at the destruction with an expression of perfect serenity that somehow managed to be more terrifying than rage would have been. His spiritual pressure was visible now, green energy crackling around him like ethereal flames. "Interesting," he said, his voice carrying the analytical detachment that marked Ulquiorra's influence. "This pain entity has caused significant structural damage to both the physical infrastructure and the spiritual cohesion of the village. The death toll is substantial." Below him, he could see the Deva path floating above the crater where the Hokage Tower used to stand, arms spread wide as gravitational forces began to gather for the ultimate technique. "Almighty push," Pain declared, his voice echoing across the devastated landscape. "Let this world know pain." The technique launched with earth-shattering force, a wave of destructive gravity that should have obliterated everything in its path. But instead of hitting the village, it struck something else. A wall of pure spiritual pressure that appeared between Pain and his target like a barrier made of crystallized void. "Fascinating," Naruto said as he descended from the monument, moving not by jumping but by simply choosing to exist in a different location. A technique that manipulates gravitational fields through ocular jutsu. Impressive, but ultimately limited by its reliance on conventional physics. He landed softly in the crater, his feet touching down on debris that immediately began to frost over from the supernatural cold radiating from his transformed state. Pain's 6 paths converged on him from all directions, but Naruto simply stood there and observed them with scientific curiosity. 6 bodies, 1 consciousness distributed across multiple forms, he mused as they attacked in perfect coordination. A clever solution to the problem of mortality, but it reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what consciousness truly is. The animal path summoned a massive 3-headed dog, its jaws slavering as it lunged toward the blonde figure. Naruto raised one hand and the beast simply stopped, frozen in midair by spiritual pressure so overwhelming that it couldn't complete the motion of attack. "Consciousness is not something that can be divided," he explained conversationally as the other paths tried desperately to reach him through the field of paralyzing energy. "It is a single, indivisible process that defines the nature of existence itself. What you have created is not 6 conscious beings, but 6 puppets dancing to the rhythm of one broken soul." The Deva path attempted another Shinra Tensei, but the gravitational wave simply dispersed when it encountered Naruto's spiritual pressure, like water breaking against an immovable mountain. "Your techniques assume that power can be measured in conventional terms," Naruto continued, his eyes now fully transformed to green-black, pupils contracted to thin slits that seemed to pierce through the fabric of reality itself. "But what happens when you face someone who exists beyond such limitations?" He raised both hands, and spiritual energy began to coalesce between his palms, not the familiar green of a Zero, but something darker, more refined, more fundamentally destructive. "Zero Oscuras," he said softly, and the space between his hands filled with darkness so absolute that it seemed to devour light itself. "The Black Zero, a technique that doesn't just destroy matter, it annihilates the very concept of existence within its area of effect." Pain's eyes widened as he felt the sheer destructive potential radiating from the attack. Even his Rinnegan, which could perceive the flow of all chakra, couldn't fully comprehend what it was seeing. But instead of firing, Naruto allowed the technique to dissipate. "However," he said with a slight smile that somehow managed to be both warm and utterly terrifying, "destruction is not what this situation requires. What you need, Nagato, is understanding." The name hit like a physical blow. Pain stumbled backward, his multiple bodies moving in perfect synchronization as they tried to process how this young man could know his true identity. "You hide behind these puppets because you fear the vulnerability that comes with existing in a single form," Naruto observed, beginning to walk forward with unhurried steps. "You spread your consciousness across 6 bodies because you believe it will protect you from the pain of loss. But all you've accomplished is to fragment yourself into pieces, each one carrying a fraction of the whole." As he moved, his form began to change. The markings on his skin became more pronounced, intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living mathematics. His hair grew longer, moving with currents that existed in dimensions beyond the physical world. "I understand that pain," he continued, his voice now carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I have existed as emptiness itself, as the perfect absence of connection and meaning. I know what it feels like to be so broken that the very concept of wholeness becomes foreign." Wings began to manifest behind him, not the crude constructs of chakra manipulation, but actual appendages of bone and membrane that belonged to something beyond human classification. His nails lengthened into claws that could carve through the boundaries between dimensions. "This is resurrection," he explained as his transformation progressed. "The return to one's true form. The revelation of what lies beneath the mask of false humanity." The 6 paths attacked with renewed desperation, launching every technique in their arsenal. But Naruto moved through their assault like a force of nature, his enhanced form allowing him to exist partially outside the normal flow of time and space. "Your techniques are impressive," he said as he effortlessly avoided the Usura Path's missile barrage, "but they're built on a foundation of fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of power." He caught one of the human path's soul extraction attempts with his bare hand, and the puppet stumbled as its technique encountered something that existed on multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. "Power is not about the ability to destroy," Naruto continued, crushing the human path's wrist with casual strength. "It's about the ability to choose restraint when destruction would be easier." The remaining paths converged on him in a final, desperate assault, but Naruto had already moved beyond their ability to track or counter. He appeared behind the Deva path, moving faster than even the Rinnegan could perceive. "Now," he said softly, "let me show you what happens when emptiness learns to care." His form underwent one final transformation. The wings on his back grew larger, more imposing, while horns spiraled from his temples and his tail lashed behind him like a living weapon. His appearance had become something from the intersection of nightmare and divine vision, beautiful and terrible, alien yet somehow achingly familiar. "Segunda etapa," he announced, his voice now carrying harmonics that made the very air resonate. "The second stage of resurrection, the form that transcends the boundaries between existence and void." In this state, he was no longer recognizable as human. His spiritual pressure was so overwhelming that it created visible distortions in space-time, and when he spoke, reality itself seemed to listen. "In this form, I could unmake you with a thought," he said matter-of-factly to Pain's assembled bodies. "I could erase your existence so completely that even the memory of your passing would fade from the universe. But do you know why I don't?" He raised one hand, and spiritual energy began to gather around his fingertips, not destructive force, but something far more dangerous to someone like Pain. "Lanza del Relampago," he whispered, and a spear of pure lightning materialized in his grasp. Not the crude electricity of ninja techniques, but the fundamental force that existed between the boundaries of matter and energy, thought and reality. The weapon pulsed with power that belonged to the realm of gods, not the false divinity that mortals aspired to, but the genuine authority of beings who had transcended the normal limitations of existence. This technique was designed to pierce the hearts of those who believed themselves beyond mortal reach, Naruto explained as he drew back his arm. It doesn't just destroy the body, it strikes at the very core of what makes someone who they are. Pain tried to dodge, tried to use Shinra Tensei to deflect the attack, tried every technique in his arsenal. But the spear existed partially outside normal space-time, and when Naruto threw it, the weapon simply chose to exist where its target was rather than traveling through the intervening distance. It should have been fatal. Should have pierced through Pain's chest and annihilated him on every level of existence. Instead, it stopped inches from the Deva Path's heart, held back by nothing more than Naruto's choice not to complete the attack. Because, he said softly, allowing the spear to dissipate into motes of green light, "You're not my enemy, you're just someone who has forgotten what it means to hope." His segunda etapa began to fade, wings and horns dissolving back into spiritual energy. The markings on his skin retreated, and his eyes returned to their familiar blue, though they retained depths that spoke of experiences beyond mortal comprehension. "You want the world to know pain," he continued, his voice now carrying both the authority of a being who had commanded armies and the warmth of someone who had learned to care. "But pain without the possibility of healing is just another form of emptiness, and I've seen where that leads." He took a step forward, extending his hand toward the Deva Path in a gesture that should have been impossible given the vast difference in their power levels. "Let me show you something better," he said with a smile that was pure Naruto Uzumaki. "Let me show you what it means to fill the void with something other than suffering." The confrontation that followed was not a battle but a conversation, two beings who had touched the depths of absolute despair, sharing their understanding of what lay beyond pain. And when it ended, when Nagato made his choice to believe in something greater than the cycle of hatred, it was not through force or manipulation. It was through the simple recognition that emptiness, no matter how vast, could always be filled with something better. As the six paths collapsed and Nagato used the last of his life force to restore those who had fallen in the attack, Naruto knelt beside the emaciated form of the man who had once been his enemy. "Thank you," Nagato whispered with his dying breath, "for showing me that the void doesn't have to be the end of the story." Standing in the ruins of his village, surrounded by the restored lives of everyone Pain had killed, Naruto felt something shift within the hollow hole in his chest. Not emptiness learning to be full, but the recognition that emptiness and fullness were not opposites. They were different aspects of the same fundamental truth. The heart was not something you possessed or protected. It was something you chose to use again and again, despite the certainty of loss and pain. And in that choice, Naruto Uzumaki, who was also Ulquiorra Cifer, who was also something entirely new, found the answer to the question that had haunted him since his awakening. He was not hollow learning to be human, or human learning to be hollow. He was something unprecedented, a being who had embraced both emptiness and meaning, who had chosen connection despite understanding the nature of void. The question was no longer what he was becoming. The question was what the world would do with someone who had learned to find infinite meaning in the space between existence and nothingness. The Fourth Shinobi World War erupted across the continent like a fever breaking, and with it came revelations that challenged everything the ninja world thought it knew about power, identity, and the nature of existence itself. When Naruto arrived at the battlefield, his spiritual pressure preceding him like a herald of otherworldly authority, even the reanimated dead paused in their eternal conflict to witness something unprecedented. He moved through the war zone with fluid grace that belonged to someone who had transcended the normal limitations of mortality, his form flickering between human and something far more complex. The hollow hole in his chest was visible now through his modified flak jacket, not as an absence, but as a perfect circle filled with swirling galaxies of green light that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. "Naruto," Gaara said when they met on the main battlefield, his sand automatically recoiling from the spiritual pressure that surrounded his fellow Jinchuriki like an aura of crystallized void. "You've changed again." We all have, Naruto replied, his blue eyes containing depths that seemed to reflect the memories of multiple lifetimes. War has a way of revealing what we truly are beneath the masks we wear for peacetime. Around them, the allied shinobi forces were engaged in desperate combat with Kabuto's reanimated army, but Naruto's attention was focused elsewhere, on the spiritual signatures that blazed like beacons in his enhanced perception. Madara Uchiha, whose presence carried the weight of legends made manifest. The 10 Tails, a concentration of malevolent chakra that registered as something between natural disaster and cosmic horror. And somewhere beyond the immediate battlefield, a spiritual pressure that made his hollow hole resonate with recognition. Sasuke Uchiha, no longer the broken boy who had fled Konoha years ago, but something forged by pain and tempered by understanding into a weapon aimed at the heart of destiny itself. The war is just the surface, Naruto said softly, his voice carrying harmonics that belonged in no human throat. The real battle is being fought in the spaces between existence and void, between meaning and emptiness. When Madara descended from the heavens like a meteor wrapped in divine authority, his presence alone was enough to turn the tide of battle. The legendary Uchiha moved with the casual confidence of someone who had transcended mortality through will alone, his techniques reshaping the very landscape with contemptuous ease. "So," he said as his eyes found Naruto among the allied forces, "you're the anomaly I've been sensing, that spiritual pressure. It doesn't belong to this world." Naruto stepped forward, his form beginning to shimmer as Ulquiorra's memories stirred in response to facing a being of truly godlike power. "Madara Uchiha, a man who sought to become a god through manipulation and force. You remind me of someone I once knew, another who believed that power could fill the void where meaning should exist." "Interesting," Madara mused, his eternal Mangekyo sharing and spinning as it tried to analyze the energy radiating from the young man. "Your chakra signature is complex, as if you exist on multiple dimensional planes simultaneously." "Not chakra," Naruto corrected, his eyes shifting to that familiar green-black, "and not entirely singular either. I am what happens when emptiness learns to choose meaning over void." The battle that followed transcended the normal boundaries of ninja combat. When Madara launched his perfect Susanoo, the ethereal giant should have been unstoppable, a manifestation of divine will made manifest through ocular prowess. But Naruto simply raised his hand, and the massive construct's sword strike stopped mere inches from his face, held back by spiritual pressure so dense it had become nearly solid. "Your technique is impressive," he observed clinically as cracks began to appear in the Susanoo's armor. "A manifestation of spiritual energy given form and purpose through emotional resonance. But it assumes your opponent operates within the same dimensional parameters." He gestured, and the perfect Susanoo simply wasn't there anymore. Not destroyed, not dispelled, but relocated to a space between dimensions where conventional physics held no meaning. "Garganta," he explained to Madara's shocked expression. "The technique of opening doorways between realms. What you just experienced was your construct being temporarily displaced to a dimension where the concept of physical form has no relevance." Madara's eyes narrowed, his legendary pride stung by the casual dismissal of his most powerful technique. "What are you?" "I am Naruto Uzumaki," came the reply, spoken with the warmth of someone who had never forgotten the bonds that defined him. "But I am also the echo of Ulquiorra Cifer, who stood in the shadow of false gods and found them lacking." His form began to change, spiritual energy gathering around him like a cocoon of crystallized starlight. When it dispersed, he stood revealed in his resurrection, pale skin marked with intricate patterns, hair that moved like it was underwater, wings of bone and membrane spreading behind him like fragments of some cosmic design. "This is what I have become," he said, his voice now carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "Neither human nor hollow, but something that chooses connection over isolation, meaning over emptiness." The battle escalated beyond anything the watching ninja had ever witnessed. Madara, drawing upon techniques that belonged in the realm of legends, found himself matched at every turn by someone who seemed to exist outside the normal rules of combat. When he summoned meteors from the sky, Naruto caught them with his bare hands, his spiritual pressure allowing him to interact with objects regardless of their mass or velocity. "Your understanding of power is fundamentally flawed," Naruto said as he casually tossed a meteor aside, the massive stone disappearing into another dimensional rift. You believe that strength is about imposing your will upon reality, but true power lies in understanding that reality is far more complex than any individual perspective. He raised both hands, and spiritual energy began to coalesce between his palms, not the destructive force of a Zero, but something far more sophisticated. "Zero Metroletta," he said softly, and suddenly the air was filled with thousands of tiny spiritual bullets, each one precisely aimed and calibrated to incapacitate rather than destroy. A technique that demonstrates the difference between crude force and refined application of power. Madara found himself overwhelmed not by the destructive potential of the attack, but by its surgical precision. Each spiritual bullet struck nerve clusters, pressure points, chakra pathways, not to kill, but to demonstrate the vast gulf between their respective understandings of combat. "Impossible," the legendary Uchiha gasped as his body began to shut down under the assault. No one has ever faced someone who exists partially outside the normal flow of space and time," Naruto completed gently. "Your techniques, impressive as they are, assume your opponent shares your dimensional limitations." But even as Madara fell, something else was stirring on the battlefield. The spiritual pressure that Naruto had been tracking throughout the war was finally approaching. Sasuke Uchiha, no longer the broken boy seeking power, but something refined by years of understanding into a force that could stand alongside gods. "Naruto?" Sasuke's voice carried across the battlefield as he materialized beside the fallen Madara, his new Rinnegan spinning with power that challenged the very foundations of reality. "It's time." "Time for what?" Naruto asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "To finish what we started at the Valley of the End," Sasuke replied, his spiritual pressure beginning to manifest as visible flames around his form. "To determine which of our philosophies will guide the world forward." Naruto studied his oldest friend, noting the way Sasuke's energy had evolved, no longer the crude hatred that had defined his youth, but something more refined, more purposeful. "You've changed." "We both have," Sasuke acknowledged. "But the fundamental question remains, can the world be saved through connection or must it be protected through control?" Around them, the war continued to rage, but both young men knew that the real battle was about to begin, not between ninja and their techniques, but between two philosophies that would determine the future of all existence. When the Ten Tails finally manifested in its complete form, the beast's spiritual pressure was so overwhelming that it created visible distortions in space-time. This was not just a tailed beast, it was the original source of chakra itself, the primordial force that had given birth to the very concept of ninja arts. But Naruto looked at it with the analytical detachment of someone who had faced beings of similar power in realms where physics was merely a suggestion. "Interesting," he mused, his spiritual senses mapping the creature's energy patterns with scientific precision. "A concentration of chakra so dense that it has achieved a form of pseudo-consciousness. Not truly alive, but not entirely inanimate either." He began to transform again, but this time the change was different, more complete, more fundamental. His segunda etapa manifested not as a weapon of war, but as a demonstration of what lay beyond the normal boundaries of existence. Wings of pure spiritual energy unfurled behind him, each feather containing enough power to level mountains. Horns spiraled from his temples like antennae designed to perceive dimensions beyond human comprehension. His tail lashed behind him, not with violent intent, but with the fluid grace of something that existed in harmony with forces beyond mortal understanding. "This is Segunda Etapa," he announced, his voice now carrying harmonics that made reality itself resonate. "The form that transcends the boundaries between life and death, between existence and void." In this state, he was no longer recognizable as human, but somehow his essential nature, the warmth, the determination, the unshakable belief in the power of bonds, remained unchanged. "Now," he said, raising one hand toward the Ten Tails, "let me show you what happens when someone who has experienced true emptiness chooses to fill it with meaning." The technique he used was not one of destruction, but of understanding. Spiritual energy flowed from him in waves, not attacking the Ten Tails but analyzing it, comprehending its nature at the most fundamental level. "Pesquisa absoluta," he whispered, and suddenly he could see the 10 tails for what it truly was, not a monster to be destroyed, but a fragment of something larger, a piece of the cosmic puzzle that had been separated from its whole. "You're not evil," he said to the massive creature, his voice carrying both authority and compassion. "You're just incomplete, alone, cut off from the connections that give existence meaning." The 10 tails paused in its rampage, its multiple eyes focusing on this small figure who somehow commanded its attention despite their vast difference in size. "I understand that feeling," Naruto continued, his segunda etapa allowing him to project his voice directly into the creature's consciousness. "I've been there in that perfect void where connection has no meaning, where existence is just an endless cycle of emptiness." He extended his hand toward the beast, and for a moment the gesture bridged the gap between mortal and divine, between finite and infinite. But emptiness doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning, the potential for something greater than what came before. The war's climax came not through violence, but through understanding. When Kaguya finally manifested, her presence carrying the weight of cosmic authority that belonged to the original source of chakra itself, Naruto faced her not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a being who had forgotten what it meant to connect. "You seek to control all chakra," he observed as they battled across dimensions that shifted and flowed according to her will, "but you've never understood what chakra truly is." His segunda etapa allowed him to exist partially outside the normal flow of spacetime, making him immune to many of her reality-warping techniques. When she attempted to trap him in a dimension of absolute gravity, he simply chose to exist elsewhere. "Chakra is not power," he continued, appearing behind her with the fluid grace of someone who had forgotten the concept of physical limitations. "It's connection. It's the force that binds all living things together, that makes bonds possible across the vastness of existence." The final technique he used was neither Ulquiorra's cold perfection nor Naruto's warm determination, but something that encompassed both. A Lanza del Relampago forged not from spiritual energy alone, but from the combined power of every connection he had ever made. "This is what you never understood," he said as the spear of lightning formed in his grasp, pulsing with the accumulated bonds of a lifetime spent choosing connection over isolation. "Power shared is not power diminished, it's power infinitely multiplied." When the technique struck, it didn't destroy Kaguya so much as remind her of what she had forgotten, the warmth of connection, the meaning that came from choosing to care about others despite the risk of loss. In the aftermath, as the world struggled to rebuild from the devastation of war, Naruto stood on the Hokage monument and contemplated the path that had brought him to this moment. He was no longer the lonely child who had dreamed of acknowledgement, nor was he the cold analytical being who had once served false gods. He was something entirely new, a fusion of emptiness and meaning, of void and connection, of the analytical perfection of Ulquiorra Cifer and the boundless heart of Naruto Uzumaki. The hollow hole in his chest was still there, but it no longer represented absence. It had become a window, a way of seeing the infinite potential that existed in the space between existence and nothingness. "Sensei," he said to Jiraiya's memory, his voice carrying both gratitude and understanding, "I finally figured it out. The heart isn't something you have, it's something you choose to use again and again, despite knowing that everything you care about will eventually be lost." As the sun set over the hidden village, Naruto made his own choice, not between his human nature and his hollow heritage, but to embrace both as different aspects of the same fundamental truth. He would be the bridge between emptiness and meaning, showing the world that even the deepest void could be filled with something beautiful if you were willing to keep choosing connection over isolation. The question was no longer what he was becoming. The question was what the world would become with someone who had learned to find infinite meaning in the perfect balance between existence and nothingness. 2 years had passed since the end of the Fourth Shinobi World War, and the world had settled into a peace that felt both fragile and profound. Naruto stood in the Hokage's office, his office now, the hat resting on his desk like a crown he had never sought but had grown to understand, watching the sunrise paint Konoha in shades of gold and possibility. The hollow hole in his chest remained, but it had evolved beyond anything Ulquiorra Cifer could have imagined. What had once been a perfect circle of emptiness now resembled a mandala of interconnected light, each point representing a bond forged, a connection chosen, a moment when he had decided that meaning mattered more than void. "You're brooding again," Sakura observed as she entered with the morning reports, her medical training automatically cataloging the subtle fluctuations in his spiritual pressure that still occurred when he contemplated the deeper mysteries of existence. "Contemplating?" Naruto corrected with a smile that managed to be both warmly human and otherworldly serene. "There's a difference between brooding and processing the philosophical implications of existing as a bridge between dimensions. Only you would make becoming Hokage sound like a metaphysical crisis," she replied, though her tone carried affection rather than criticism. Over the years, they had all grown accustomed to the way Naruto's dual nature manifested in his approach to leadership, analytical precision tempered by unwavering compassion. Through the window, they could see the village bustling with activity. Children played in streets that had been rebuilt stronger than before, their laughter a testament to the peace that had been purchased with so much sacrifice. But Naruto's enhanced senses could perceive layers beneath the surface, the spiritual pressures of individuals, the ebb and flow of chakra through the village's infrastructure, the subtle harmonics that indicated a community in balance. "Report on the Dimensional Research Project?" he asked, settling behind his desk with the fluid grace that had never left him since his awakening. "Fascinating and terrifying in equal measure," Sakura replied, consulting her notes. "The team you assigned to study Garganta manipulation has made significant progress. They're convinced that with proper understanding, we could revolutionize transportation and communication across the entire ninja world. And the risks? The same as always when dealing with forces beyond conventional understanding. One miscalculation could tear holes in reality itself." Naruto nodded thoughtfully. Since becoming Hokage, he had gradually introduced selected techniques from Ulquiorra's memories to the village's research divisions, always carefully, always with extensive safeguards, always with the understanding that power without wisdom was just another form of emptiness. "What about the other villages' reactions to our innovations?" "Mixed," Sakura admitted. "The older generation still views your abilities with suspicion. They remember the war, remember seeing you transform into something that challenged their understanding of what human means. But the younger ninja are fascinated. Some are even requesting to study under you directly." It was a delicate balance Naruto had learned. The world needed to evolve, needed to understand that the boundaries they had accepted as absolute were merely suggestions. But change had to come gradually, with consent rather than force, with understanding rather than imposition. The knock on his door came at precisely the time Naruto had been expecting it, his spiritual senses having detected the familiar presence approaching through the village. When Sasuke entered, he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had finally made peace with all aspects of his nature. "Naruto," he said simply, settling into the chair across from the Hokage's desk without ceremony. "We need to talk. About the reports from your intelligence network, or about the philosophical implications of your latest discoveries regarding the nature of chakra itself." Sasuke's mouth quirked upward in what might have been a smile. "Both, always both with you." Over the past 2 years, their relationship had evolved into something unprecedented, not the rivalry of their youth, nor the tragic opposition of their adolescence, but a partnership between two beings who had transcended normal human limitations in different but complementary ways. Where Naruto had learned to balance emptiness with connection, Sasuke had mastered the art of using solitude in service of protection. "The outer villages are reporting strange phenomena," Sasuke began, producing a scroll filled with detailed observations. "Spatial distortions, fluctuations in chakra that don't match any known techniques, and in 3 separate locations, witnesses describe seeing what they call tears in the sky." Naruto's expression grew serious as he reviewed the reports, his analytical mind, the part that belonged to Ulquiorra, immediately beginning to process the implications. "Dimensional instability. Someone or something is attempting to breach the barriers between realms. That's what I thought too, but there's something else." Sasuke's Rinnegan spun slowly as he activated its perception abilities. "The spiritual pressure signatures don't match anything from our world. They're hollow, empty in a way that reminds me of your transformed states but without the underlying warmth." The words hit Naruto like a physical blow. He had always known this day might come. The possibility that his existence as a bridge between worlds might eventually attract attention from the realm where Ulquiorra Cifer had originated. but he had hoped it would happen later when the world was more prepared to understand what such contact might mean. How many? He asked quietly. Unknown, but based on the pattern of disturbances, I'd estimate at least a dozen separate incursion attempts over the past month. Naruto was quiet for a long moment, his consciousness partially slipping into the space where Ulquiorra's memories resided. In that crystalline realm of perfect recollection, he could access knowledge of Huko Mundo, of the eternal war between Hollows and Soul Reapers, of the delicate balance that existed between dimensions. They sense me, he realized. My spiritual pressure has been growing stronger, more refined. It's acting like a beacon. Naruto, Sasuke's voice brought him back to the present. We may have a problem, he admitted. My existence as a fusion of human and hollow essences appears to be attracting attention from beings that exist in realms beyond our normal dimensional parameters. Other Espada? Unlikely. The Espada were destroyed or transformed during events that occurred long before my current incarnation. But there are other entities, hollows, or rancor, beings of pure spiritual pressure that exist in dimensions where the normal rules of physics hold no meaning. Sasuke leaned forward, his expression growing grave. And they're coming here? It appears so. The question is whether they're seeking to understand what I've become or to eliminate what they perceive as an aberration. The first confirmed breach occurred 3 days later in a forest clearing 50 miles north of Konoha. Naruto arrived at the scene within minutes, his Sonido allowing him to cover the distance faster than any conventional transportation method. What he found there challenged even his expanded understanding of dimensional mechanics. The tear in reality was beautiful and terrible, a wound in the fabric of spacetime that revealed glimpses of another realm beyond. Through it, he could see the eternal night of Huko Mundo, the white sand dunes that stretched to infinity, the twisted architecture of Las Notches gleaming in the distance like a fever dream made manifest. And stepping through the breach was something that made even Naruto's enhanced spiritual senses recoil in recognition. It was an rancor, not one of the numbered Espada, but something older, more primal. Its spiritual pressure carried the weight of centuries spent in the void between existence and nothingness, and when it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that belonged in no mortal throat. So, it said, its mask fragment gleaming white against pale skin, you are the anomaly that has been disturbing the balance between realms. I am Naruto Uzumaki, he replied, his own spiritual pressure beginning to manifest as visible energy around his form. 7th Hokage of Konohagakure, Jinchuriki of the Nine-Tailed Fox, and heir to memories that belong to Ulquiorra Cifer, 4th Espada of Aizen Sasuke's army. The rancor's eyes widened slightly at the mention of Ulquiorra's name. Impossible, the 4th Espada was destroyed during the Winter War. His essence was scattered across dimensions, lost to the void. Not lost, Naruto corrected, his eyes shifting to that familiar green-black. Reborn, transformed. Given the opportunity to discover what the original never understood. And what is that? Naruto smiled, and the expression carried both the warmth of someone who had learned to love and the ancient wisdom of someone who had mastered emptiness itself. That the heart is not something you possess, he said softly. It's something you choose to use. The battle that followed was unlike anything the ninja world had ever witnessed. Two beings of transcendent power faced off in a forest clearing, their techniques reshaping reality itself with casual ease. But what made the confrontation truly remarkable was not the scale of destruction. Indeed, Naruto seemed determined to minimize collateral damage, but the philosophical nature of their conflict. You are an abomination, the rancor snarled as it launched a Zero that should have annihilated everything in its path. A fusion of human warmth and hollow emptiness that should not exist. Naruto caught the spiritual energy blast with his bare hand, his Hiro allowing him to absorb the attack without visible effect. An abomination or an evolution? Tell me, in all your centuries of existence in the void between realms, have you ever found anything worth caring about? Caring is weakness, the rancor replied, drawing a Zanpakuto that hummed with the power to cut through dimensional barriers. Attachment leads to vulnerability, vulnerability to defeat. And yet, Naruto observed as he effortlessly avoided the blade's strike, here you are, traveling across dimensions to eliminate someone whose very existence challenges your philosophy. If attachment is truly weakness, why does my choice to embrace connection threaten you so much? The question struck home in a way that physical attacks could not. The Urankar stumbled, its perfect form wavering as doubt began to creep into its consciousness. Because, it whispered, if you can exist as both empty and full, if you can find meaning in the void itself, then everything we've believed about the nature of power becomes wrong, Naruto completed gently. Not evil, not weak, just incomplete. He began to transform, his resurrection manifesting not as a weapon of war but as a demonstration of possibility. Wings of bone and membrane spread behind him, his skin took on that otherworldly pallor marked with intricate patterns, and his spiritual pressure expanded to encompass concepts that had no names in any mortal language. This is what I've become, he said, his voice now carrying the authority of absolute certainty. Not Ulquiorra Cifer reborn, not Naruto Uzumaki transcended, but something entirely new, a being who has learned to find infinite meaning in the perfect balance between existence and nothingness. The Urankar stared at this impossible fusion of hollow perfection and human warmth, its worldview cracking under the weight of what it was witnessing. It's not possible, it breathed. The void cannot be filled, emptiness cannot become meaning, the laws of spiritual existence forbid it. Laws, Naruto repeated with a slight smile. Who created these laws? Who decided that emptiness and meaning must be mutually exclusive? He raised one hand, and spiritual energy began to coalesce around his fingertips, not the destructive force of a Zero, but something far more dangerous to someone who had built their entire existence around the worship of void. Lanza del Relampago, he said softly, and a spear of pure lightning materialized in his grasp. But this version of the technique was different, refined, perfected, infused with something that had never existed in Ulquiorra's original arsenal. Hope, this technique was designed to pierce the hearts of gods, he explained as the weapon pulsed with power that belonged to realms beyond mortal comprehension. But I've learned something that my predecessor never understood. The most powerful way to pierce a heart is not to destroy it, but to fill it with something it never thought possible. Instead of throwing the spear, he planted it in the ground between them. The spiritual energy flowed outward in waves, not attacking the Urankar but offering it something it had never experienced, the possibility of connection without vulnerability, of meaning without weakness. Choose, Naruto said simply. You can return to your realm of eternal emptiness, secure in the knowledge that you will never risk the pain of loss. Or you can stay and learn what it means to find meaning in the void itself. In the end, it was not violence that resolved the interdimensional crisis, but understanding. As more Urankar breached the barriers between worlds, drawn by the impossible spiritual signature of someone who had learned to balance emptiness with meaning, Naruto met each one not as an enemy but as a lost fragment of something larger. Some chose to return to Huko Mundo, unable to accept the possibility that their fundamental understanding of existence might be flawed. But others remained, becoming the first members of what would eventually be known as the Dimensional Guard, beings who existed between realms, protecting the balance that allowed multiple forms of existence to coexist. You realize what you've done, don't you? Sasuke asked one evening as they stood on the Hokage monument, watching the sun set over a village that had become something unprecedented. A nexus point where human ninja, spiritual beings, and entities from other dimensions worked together in harmony. I've chosen, Naruto replied simply. Again and again, despite every reason to embrace emptiness, I've chosen connection. I've chosen meaning. I've chosen to believe that the space between existence and nothingness isn't empty, it's infinite with possibility. His transformation was complete now, no longer the jarring shift between human and hollow, but a fluid integration of both natures. He could exist simultaneously as the warmth-hearted ninja who dreamed of protecting everyone and the analytical being who understood the fundamental structures of reality itself. The world is changing, Sasuke observed. Your example, your choices, they're inspiring others to transcend their own limitations. Good, Naruto said with satisfaction. Because the biggest lesson I learned from Ulquiorra's memories is that evolution is not about becoming something other than what you are. It's about becoming the fullest possible version of yourself. He looked down at the village below, his enhanced senses cataloging the spiritual pressures of thousands of individuals, human ninja learning to work alongside beings from other dimensions, children playing games that incorporated techniques from multiple realms of existence, researchers pushing the boundaries of what was considered possible. Ulquiorra Cifer died believing that the heart was something he could never understand, he said softly, but he was wrong. The heart isn't something you understand, it's something you choose to use again and again, despite knowing that everything you care about will eventually be lost. His hand pressed to his chest, where the hollow hole had become something unprecedented, not empty, not full, but perfectly balanced between both states. A window into the infinite potential that existed in the space between existence and nothingness. "I am Naruto Uzumaki," he said, his voice carrying both the authority of a Hokage and the wisdom of someone who had touched the deepest mysteries of existence. "I am the echo of Ulquiorra Cifer, who learned too late what it meant to have a heart. And I am something entirely new, a being who has chosen to find infinite meaning in the perfect balance between emptiness and connection." As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, each one a distant sun around which countless possibilities orbited, Naruto made his final choice, not between his human nature and his hollow heritage, but to embrace both as complementary aspects of the same fundamental truth. The heart was not something you possessed or protected. It was something you chose to use again and again, in service of connections that gave meaning to existence itself. And in that choice, in that perfect balance between void and meaning, Naruto Uzumaki had found not just his own identity, but a new way of being that showed the world what was possible when someone refused to let emptiness define them. The boy who had once dreamed of being acknowledged had become something far greater, a bridge between dimensions, a fusion of emptiness and meaning, a living demonstration that even the deepest void could be filled with infinite love if you were willing to keep choosing connection over isolation. The story of Ulquiorra Cifer, who had never understood the heart, was finally complete, but the story of Naruto Uzumaki, who had learned to find the heart in emptiness itself, was just beginning. The end. And that's the journey from lonely kid to interdimensional bridge, perfectly balancing Ulquiorra's emptiness with infinite connection. What was your favorite moment? The segunda etapa versus pain, or that philosophical valley of the end battle? Drop your thoughts below, subscribe for more insane crossover concepts, and let me know what if scenarios you want next. Peace out.